Disney's Adventure Stories. Alice in Wonderland. Too much nonsense. Alice was distracted as she sat in the tree, listening to her sister read from her history book. If I had a world of my own, everything would be nonsense, Alice said to her kitten, Dinah. Alice began to imagine a place without facts or figures or boring history lessons. Alice took Dinah on a little walk through the daisies. Suddenly, a rabbit with white fur hopped by. He was wearing clothes and carrying a pocket watch and talking to himself. "I'm late! I'm late!" he cried. Alice stared in surprise. Then, even though she knew it wasn't sensible, she hurried after the white rabbit. When he ducked into a rabbit hole, Alice crawled in after him. Inside, it was dark and cramped, and Alice couldn't quite see where she was going. Then, before she knew it, the ground beneath her was gone, and Alice was falling. "Goodbye, Dinah," she called to her kitten. It was a long, long way down, but Alice wasn't frightened. Her skirt billowed out like a parachute, and she slowly floated down. When she finally reached the bottom, she did not have a bump or a scratch on her. "Oh, Mr. Rabbit," called Alice. Soon she managed to exit the dark hole and enter a whole different world. She was still looking for the white rabbit, but instead she met a pair of twins named Tweedledee and Tweedledum. They shook Alice's hand and told her a nonsensical story. Alice loved it, but she was in such a rush to find the white rabbit. She didn't have time to stay for another. Hurrying down a path, she came upon a pretty little house. Upstairs were some cookies and a little sign that said, "Eat me." So Alice helped herself. Suddenly, she felt funny. Her feet crashed through the walls. Her arms grew out the windows. Alice had become a giant. What would she do now? Perhaps if I ate something, it would make me grow smaller, said Alice. With one bite of a carrot, Alice grew so small that she had trouble climbing down the stairs. Soon, tiny Alice found herself in a garden. The flowers were singing a lovely song about the beautiful afternoon. The rose, violets, and lilies welcomed Alice warmly until a haughty orchid called her a weed. "I'm not a weed," cried Alice, but the flowers pushed her away roughly. They did not want her to stay and take root. Angrily, Alice walked away through the tall grass. A while later, she spotted a smiling animal sitting in the trees. At first, Alice could only see his toothy grin. Then some stripes appeared, and finally a face. At last, she saw that he was a cat. Alice confessed to him that she was beginning to grow tired of all the nonsense. But the Cheshire Cat said, "Most everyone's mad here." Then he pointed the way down a path and disappeared. Taking the path pointed out by the Cheshire Cat, Alice soon wandered into a tea party. The March Hare and the Mad Hatter were singing a merry song. Alice was delighted to learn that they were celebrating their unbirthdays because it was her unbirthday too. She sat down to join them, but they kept changing seats and taking her cup away. Of all the silly nonsense, this is the stupidest tea party I've ever been to in all my life, Alice said as she walked away. In the depths of Tulgey Wood, unusual creatures peered at her. Alice sat down and started to cry. Before long, a familiar smile lit up the darkness. "Oh, Cheshire Cat!" cried Alice. "I want to go home, but I can't find my way." "That's because you have no way," said the cat. "All ways here are the Queen's way." With that, a tunnel magically appeared in the tree trunk. Alice hurried through it and found herself in a maze of hedges. Playing cards were painting the roses red. When Alice asked why, they said they had planted white roses by mistake. If the Queen of Hearts found out, they would surely lose their heads. "Goodness," said Alice. She took a paintbrush and started to help them. Then a trumpet blasted, and the playing cards lined up to make way for the Queen. The White Rabbit came running, announcing Her Majesty. It was not long before the temperamental Queen was annoyed with Alice. "Off with her head!" cried the Queen of Hearts, pointing at her. Alice ran for her life. The Queen chased her back. To the Mad Hatter's tea party. Suddenly, everything seemed so big. "I can't stop now," said Alice, "but we insist you must join us for a cup of tea," the March Hare replied. Soon he, the Mad Hatter, and Alice all fell into a giant cup of tea. Alice swirled around and around until she found herself swimming in an ocean. Then out of nowhere, a little door appeared before her. Alice ran to it, but it was locked. "I simply must get out," she cried. "But you are outside," the doorknob told her. Alice peeked through the keyhole. There, on the other side, she saw herself asleep under a tree. "Please wake up, Alice," she cried, and suddenly her Eyes opened. There was Dinah sitting on her lap. After all that nonsense, her sister's history book looked very inviting. Alice took her sister's hand and walked home. They were just in time for tea. The end.